So, hello everybody. Many thanks for joining us. This is our second session on the series of GSD live lectures, Talking Architecture. Together with this great team of students, Ala, Anna, Chris, Gabby, Ken, Jack, Noe, Shane, Selwyn, Tara, and Xiao, we have prepared a set of 7 questions for today's guests, Ilze and Heinrich Wolff of Wolff Architects. Many thanks to you guys for taking the time for this event. We really appreciate your time. We aim to extend the conversation that started this March 1st during your DSD lecture, Homage and Refusal. We want to tackle the apparent duality in your practice, on how research and building comes together, on how activism and private practice can be reconciled in a super complex context like South Africa. So here we go, Jack. It's your time.
Hi, Ilze and Heinrich. Finally, nice to meet you guys both. I'm very excited for today's conversation. We have a diverse set of questions for you guys from different diverse type of people. My partners are Gabriel Redding from the States, Ken Ismael Bagan from Puerto Rico, and I'm actually a fellow South African, and we are all in the MDES program here at the GSD. Our question today is: historical trauma and racial oppression are still deeply ingrained in post-colonial South Africa. You personally and consistently acknowledge this within your own practice, but can you expand upon what you believe the wider role of architects and architecture should be in advancing towards justice?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of context with which we practice in South Africa and Cape Town specifically, it is something that one cannot ignore. If you ignore the kind of embedded social trauma that is embedded in the spaces that we make and the spaces that we intervene in, I think that you are actually perpetuating a kind of a violence of kind of a epistemic violence of not acknowledging what is right before us, and we've consistently seen that, the kind of disavowal of the past actually creates a kind of a form of ignorance and a form of perpetuating really stupid and really violent mistakes through architecture and urban design. So for us, it's a practical issue to be able to understand in which context we're working within. So it's not something that we sort of say to be all noble and virtuous. It's something that is just practically around us. It's acknowledging the climate, it's acknowledging the kind of practical things in society, and we constantly embrace that in a way, as a way to move out of that space of trauma and move through it. We like to think through a thinker called Edouard Glissant, a Caribbean thinker, who said that you can understand the world when you tremble with it. And it is something that we take very seriously when we do work. In terms of, being an architect or an architectural practitioner or spatial practitioner, we can only take it on as our personal responsibility and try and produce a practice that has an ethical standing within a very knowledgeable context of the societal structures that make it. So it's not that we want to preach and we want to kind of think through how others should do it. We constantly just reflect on how we want to do it and how we kind of intervene in the specific projects that we get. And then through that, advancing a kind of a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking about spatial justice. It's a huge task and it's a collective task. So through our practice, we hope that we can urge others to do similar work. I mean, this is the work that we do, it's our work. So if we want to be rigorous, take our work seriously, knowledge about the context is a kind of a core part of that practice.
Thank you so much.
We're both MDES students. So Shane and I noticed from your past interviews and articles that Ilze, you speak more on the research and the socio-political approach your projects take, while Heinrich, you usually outline the architectural processes and structures of Wolff Architects projects.
So we would like to hear you speak on each other's roles and how you might define yourself within the others approach in your partnership. Ilze, in retrospect to Noero Wolff days, how have the structural or architectural methodologies of those grassroots projects influenced your design approach at Wolff Architects today?
And Heinrich, how do you place yourself critically in relation to Ilze's work, given the duality of cultural identities in your partnership?
Thank you. This is a really, really welcome question, and not an easy question to ask, but also this idea that, one partner is doing the research and another partner is doing the kind of architectural projects or the work is an idea that I struggle with personally. And it's also an idea that we're complicit with in kind of the way we talk about our work and so on. But it isn't actually the reality. The kind of work sort of really is co-produced in so many ways, So when we speak in public, we try and just sort of present a conversation between ourselves. We don't sort of propose actually the way that we work, I think we should challenge that view and that observation. We'd like to just sort of say, there's another way of reading that, as a conversation. I've got a deep respect for the Noero Wolff practice, I was witness to it for a very long time through being in partnership with Heinrich. And also with all the people that work there, a lot of the people that worked in that practice still work within our practice today, so it's completely entangled, in many respects, but they're also completely distinct, obviously, because we are different people, there's a different setup, there's a different ethics and a different sensibility. I do have a respect for that practice, and obviously it has, infiltrated in the way we practice today, purely because some of the people are still around. But I can't give you the kind of details of that, precise details of how exactly did the projects now, influence us. But it's a very ephemeral thing. It's a very sort of unconscious space of production, and it has to do with long relationships with people, a long relationship with our colleagues, like shorthand conversations, and one can see that through the work. So I think it's an ethic that I share with that practice, that I deeply respected, and that I would love to advance through this new practice of Wolff Architects.
Yeah, I can just say is that I really love this question. I think it's a very insightful thing in a way to track the histories of people and so on. But even within ourselves, Ilze and I are always fascinated by the fact that as a husband and wife architectural practice, we are unlike many others. If you think of Lacaton and Basal and Charles and Ray Eames, they're very Siamese in that the work is indistinguishable from each other. Ilze and I are quite comfortably different characters, and we always say is that we are brought together by an amorous relationship before an architectural pursuit. So we have respect for each other, we love doing stuff together, we love hanging out together, and then we just happen to do it, and then we see what the other one is doing, and that's actually really wonderful, because in my practice with Jo, we were two very similar characters, and that has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages, where I think the cross-pollination possible in a relationship like ours is extensive. And also it opens the door for others to then participate. So you can imagine if Ilze and I with this unified block just think in exactly the same way, it's very difficult for people to bring new perspectives to that. But because we think in very different ways, it opens up conversations within the office and within other people. And it also makes space for us to be able to contradict each other. And in that way, make it comfortable for people to say, oh, but there seems to be an openness to a conversation here. In the days before Ilze and I started practicing together, I would do all the foundational research for my own projects. And I have found with Ilze's skill and research, I have immense respect for her capacity as a researcher. I think she's more thorough and she has greater endurance than I have as a researcher. It's in a way for me easy to let go of this, to say, but I don't have to establish the foundational research for my own project. I can really let somebody else do it and set an agenda for me. And I can really listen to an agenda that Ilze is setting and say, well, let me then pick the thing up a little bit later in the process from what I would have done before. So it certainly has allowed me in a way to become maybe a bit more specialized and bit less generalized. But I think also through Ilze's subjectivities, she brings other perspectives. She hangs out with other kinds of people. Her mind goes into other kinds of places. And that certainly advances what we're doing collectively substantially.
Heinrich mentioned the word endurance, and I think that's a very key word in architectural projects as well. I mean, a project like the Friedenberg Hospital is a 13-year project, you know. The thing of endurance and shifting endurances, you know, it's about how do we complement and how do we have a conversation there where endurance is maybe required in a research project and endurance is maybe then required in this very long-term building project, you know, and then we help each other, you know, you kind of help and partner in those ways, you know, and complement. And it's not either or.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that the key to a successful partnership is also for each individuals to challenge each other. And that's something that Noé and I have been going through together, challenging each other with our different backgrounds.
But I think there should be a course called collaborative working. You know, how do you nurture collaborative work, collaborative partnerships? Because it is a real skill that one needs to nurture and needs to understand. You know, that's another topic.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next question.
Hi, nice to meet you. I guess see you again. I'm Tara, and my question is about how you design gray areas. So your halo and watershed projects are not so different in that there's a flexible temporal element, the substructure, that takes advantage of a permanent structure with a gap in between them. How does this gray area serve as an intermediary space to stimulate public life?
We've spoken a lot recently about this idea of a superstructure that's more permanent and a substructure that's more changeable. And, you know, for us, the primary dynamic of that is to acknowledge that we live in a context where architectural artifacts are not venerated by anybody ever. Even what we would consider the absolute greatest pieces made, say, in the 20th century, people change, and there seems to be no hesitation to change them fundamentally where their histories, in a way, are altered. And never mind non-precious buildings, where they really get changed beyond recognition and so on. Now, there's something about saying if we let go of this conception of a master work or a piece that must become a monument or this like heritage protected building where nothing can change. The question is, how do you negotiate that change? And then this gap that you're talking about between the permanent and the changeable is not so much in space. It's not so much a space. In other words, at any moment in time, this building is complete and static and exerts a certain kind of influence over its environment. But in having pieces that's easy to tamper with, that has a register of non-preciousness, as a register of the non-temporal, where it appears to be furniture rather than architecture and all the associations that conjures up in the minds of users, is in a way to say you open up a gap in time that allow people to own this building, shape it to their heart's desire, transform it, and also a sense that you don't just demolish buildings in order to move them forward. So it is a sort of consciousness about embodied energy and so on, but also a sense of how does the urban register itself in the architectural artifact? Is it just about the outside spaces? For us, not. Very often we make these semi-outdoor indoor spaces, which is entangled in the architecture, but they also the urbanity, the implication of a collective life, the implication of a public life that comes out of some of that permanent structure, where we're saying that certain things must be registered as irrelevant or highly changeable, so that you can change it without a consequence on tampering with the fundamental public life behind it, or being able to take away this public life and privatize this public domain or something like that. So that gap is one to leave it in time to open up freedoms for users that's not even born today, you know, that can come in future. But where you say, well, this does not suit us, we're thinking about this differently, but it can open up. And that is just so that the buildings are more enduring, but not as a totality, but as a system more.
So how do you then determine, like, what are the elements of a permanent architecture?
Question. It depends on the project. So in many cases, it has to do with this fundamental publicness about it. You know, Fumiko Maki also used this word superstructure, but he used it in the context of settlement. So he said it's something in the settlement pattern. You know, for us, it's both really structural. It is about urban structuring, and it's also about the character of the urban structure in the sense that for Mikomaki meant it. There is something that's saying what is really important. So on the most mundane level, the fire escapes that sit at 45 meters apart, you're not going to change them. You can just well make them permanent. The building regulations require them to be non-combustible surfaces, etc., etc. You can set them out at their maximum distance. Then there are certain things that set up a spatial composition that's the real joy and surprise behind the building. And some of those elements would be sad if that was fundamentally tarnished with. But there's something then saying, well, where would people want to change it? So if there's a market, you can imagine almost everything that touches the ground you would want to change. In a hospital, you'd want to change the walls and the services, but you wouldn't really want to change the ceiling. There's no real need to do that. So there's something that's saying, let's make the minimum elements permanent and durable and make them also out of better materials. So you'll find is that we build a lot of inexpensive buildings, but we'll try and put the money into that part that's really permanent. And then we build really cheap partitions and stuff. I mean, we're not the only people in the world, but that does that. But there's something that's saying, well, let those things be sacrificial, that you can understand them as sacrificial, or even if they're not necessarily taken away, that they're just transformed. So we've done markets where we've designed all the furniture and we say to people, do with it whatever you want. Now, there's not a great history of designers designing fine elements and then allowing people to do with them whatever they want. So they can paint them pink, they can throw them away, they can do whatever they want with it. They can change a wall into a floor or whatever. But there's a sense that you make it suit your needs now, and then in 3 years' time, somebody else occupies that space, and they're also free to have it reflect their needs. And in that sense, you don't get this atrophied kind of spaces where the buildings begin to date really badly. It's something that we've learned from commercial buildings. They sort of revitalize themselves in a very wasteful way generally. But there's something about saying, make it in such a way that people in a very simple, very inexpensive way can revitalize a space and personalize it. And you can have a sense of an evolving urbanity almost, even though it happens at an architectural scale. And that's why we're saying it's as if the city begins to permeate the architectural artifact.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, Ilze and Heinrich. My name is Selwyn. Thank you for being here. My question is about a post-occupancy report or a critical self-reflection. So throughout your lectures and writings, there's a consistent expression of a desire to imbue design with joy, happiness, justice, and love, all elusive and slippery terms. We wonder if you as a practice conduct any post-occupancy studies of your buildings to evaluate their effectiveness in producing these ephemeral or emotive objectives. How do you take responsibility for the choices that you make in your projects?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Selwyn. This is a great question. And we have an agenda, you know, and it is about joy, desire, love, happiness, justice. That's our agenda. And I'm sorry if it's slippery, but that's just our agenda. It does come with a level of responsibility, you know, because you have a sense in some cases that people say these kinds of things and then it becomes a kind of a virtue signaling, you know, that we do these things and we do it for the good. And then when you actually see the projects, it's not at all how they've been advocated for as, you know, in the public sphere. And it's all more often about, you know, a sense of saving a context or saving a kind of a person or all of that, you know. So we see that and we get quite irritated by those kinds of things going around, you know, the kind of savior archetype, you know. And in Africa, it is very rampant, especially Europeans coming and, you know, being the white savior that saved Africa from its past and from poverty and development. And we take those things very seriously. The short answer to this question is that we don't necessarily do the formal post-occupancy reports because that's a whole space in itself. It's very technical and it's all of that. But we do often visit the buildings. We just go and see what's happening. I mean, the watershed is in the public sphere, so we go there often. We take people, when they come and visit, we take people to the public buildings. But the example that you've just put up there is a very curious example in this set, because that's a very good friend of ours' house. So we often go there, these friends of ours, we just go and we hang out and we see what the effects of the intervention that we made for them, in terms of that we actually made with them. We had a fantastic braai there. And I love the fact that that image so focused on the braai. You know what a braai is? That element there, that sort of curved
little white
building on the side, on the right-hand side of the image, that is what you call a braai. Is where you're going to be cooking your food, meat, and basically all the deliciousness of the evening is coming out of. So it is a very specific part of that courtyard. And, our post-occupancy report is in the form of going there and having a braai and chilling with them and, really enjoying the space with them. And during COVID, theatre has been a very limited space to be in, to experience, and a lot of theatre practitioners have actually gone under and suffering very much. So Maya and Gerard opened their house and their courtyard for an acclaimed theatre practitioner in South Africa to host micro theatre experiences in their courtyard. 15 people at a time, it's all open air, and it was a fabulous experience, and they are theatre people themselves, they are creative people, they're artists. So they also take a lot of responsibility for that space, in terms of the kind of elevated nature that space can be. And we enjoy it, basically. We enjoyed it, and we go and see that. In this particular space, we do find that our agenda finds a place in this particular space,
This question is, how do you take responsibility for the choices that you make? And the question is, at one level you think, a comedian never explains his jokes. It's just not what you do. You don't ask Jay-Z to write an analysis of his own songs. It's just boring. You don't, nobody's interested in that. But in architecture, it is a bit different, because we make claims for things, and you certainly want to know whether they achieve effect. You'd be very self-obsessed if you just claim things for buildings and you really don't you have no regard for whether they actually have any effect in real life. But there's a long history of architects doing that. The fundamental basis of that, let's call it analysis, is conversation. So one is we go to the buildings over and over afterwards, as Ilze said, and we are very lucky to have good relations with the users of our buildings consistently. And then through that, it's a challenge to listen to both the compliments and the criticism, because usually the compliments are the most hollow things, to be quite honest. People say, this is really nice. There's nothing I can do with that information. It does not take my thoughts forward. I'm flattered. It's very nice. I'm glad people are happy. But it adds no understanding if somebody says, this is really, really nice. You understand? What is far more interesting is if somebody says something that's maybe more critical, including hypercritical things, because I think sometimes that's usually not said to you. You hear it through the grapevine and so on. And those things are very interesting, because people don't engage with you on it, but it doesn't mean you cannot engage with that idea. So somebody would say the scale of this building is wrong. And there's something about really thinking about it. Or for instance, I was involved in a housing project 23 years ago. Very provocative, I think still to today very successful. But then we heard that very senior people in government came past it, they drove past, they never even stopped, and then in public lambasted the project. And we heard what they were saying. And it was really curious for me. And there was something about understanding the origin of that criticism and the difficulty they had with such a strong proposal. And it has shaped my career. It doesn't mean that project wasn't good, but I realized the way those ideas manifested them through this project got people's backs up, because it attacked their positions, but by a pure, by a contrast So there's a very conventional idea of what constitutes housing, and now there's a provocative idea of what it could be. And that unsettled people, and then they try and degrade, in a way, the project through comment. But it made me also understand that you could let ideas land into society through other things other than buildings, and then have far more success advancing those ideas because they don't come with us as the authors of it. So Ilze and I have developed this thing of developing ideas that does not come through us. You can say it's research, but it is opportunistic speculation about things that we see in the world that we can present as not being the authors of it, that people don't feel threatened by the fact that we present them, for instance. But the moment we say, we believe this is the way to do it, then you find a whole lot of people might think differently of it. So that's one of the lessons, for instance, I've learned through a moment of criticism. It wasn't necessarily a criticism of the ideas per se or the buildings per se, but it is really important to listen to your adversaries, because there are not that many. The reality is there are very few people who are prepared to put up their hands and say, we think you made a mistake here, or don't you think you could have done it much better if you did the following? People are generally very appreciative and respectful, and that hinders access to a lively debate. We don't have a public culture of debate around architecture. People sort of chat behind people's backs, and I'm often very venomous without trying to find common cause and a sort of way forward. But I think it is very useful to enter into conversations with people and everybody. You design a hospital, you ask the nurse, the cleaner, the surgeon, the whatever, how do they like this? And you really listen to what they're saying, because out of that is just the tip of an iceberg of somebody coming up with an idea. And there's something about taking that idea very seriously, and then people usually will give you a bit more and a bit more. That, I think, is very necessary as a way of learning and checking whether what you were trying really works, whether the motives are legible. Because, one of the other bizarre fantasies of the elitist architect is that, I've got such great ideas. If you don't get it, it's your problem. You're undereducated or whatever, something like that. Where there's something, we always think that if people don't share the motives that we have in our buildings, it's our failure in a way. Yeah. And that you've got to crack this thing open, and you've got to have it simple enough as a narrative that people can understand why you're doing something as it's been done. It can't be that you have to read the book, see the movie, and then come and appreciate the building. We don't like those kinds of artifacts.
Very often in the case, we are the principal agents, and I don't know how practice works in America, but principal agents, you have a kind of responsibility for all the other consultants on a project, and you manage the contract in the construction business. But prior to that moment, there is a kind of a shared responsibility that you need to create with everybody. You have a responsibility to make sure that the decisions that you've made as designers, as architects, for the particular project are ethical and are within a kind of a space that you are comfortable with and everybody's comfortable with. But I think there's also a responsibility to share that, to make sure that the responsibility is shared amongst others beyond, the principal agent or the architects or everybody else involved, and ultimately also the users, and the clients, that they share a level of responsibility and aware of the responsibility that they share. But one can also take responsibility for buildings that are not your own or not your own creation, for instance, So we've taken responsibility, to ask us why, for a lot of modernist ruins, in South Africa. We've sort of paying attention to why are they in ruins as, states. What can we do? How can we, create a kind of an aura around it that it becomes renewed as a new conversation, opens up new things. So yeah, responsibility should be shared, but also one can take on, responsibilities beyond the work that you create yourself, because ultimately it's about the work that one does, as architects. And if you take your work seriously, the material culture of that work becomes your responsibility in a sense,
Well, thank you for such a deep and rich answer to that question. And I have a follow-up. Heinrich, you kind of opened up the door with this idea of like hypercriticality. You've called out Mies with the Farnsworth House, Corbusier with the Carpenter Center, and Olgiati very specifically. So I was wondering what the agenda is with that. If that plays into your agenda of hypercriticality or public discourse on what architecture is and what it is.
Yes, I can maybe just say is that, you know, there's a balance that one must find between being very critical of the past and just being so full of poison that nobody ever wants to come anywhere near you. You know, our local architecture school here has a long tradition of hypercriticality without necessarily that support, you know, of supporting great ideas or being enthusiastic about naive explorations. If you are too critical, you just break everything down. But, you know, something like Farnsworth House is held up as one of the greatest things of our time. I mean, if you look at Alice Rawsthorne published it today, and as critical as she is of gender relations, she hardly mentions the abuse that Mies van der Rohe dished out to Mrs. Farnsworth. And I'm so surprised. I was quite shocked actually at the post today. She did not mention that Mies prescribed to her what kind of dresses she should wear in the countryside to make for nice cupboards that fits into his house, basically. That he refused to put mosquito nets in a place that's besieged by mosquitoes. That he didn't build it high enough to really be above the floodplain, to do a whole lot of things that is just actually misses the mark. Somehow when he's gotten far enough with the building, the relationship with Mrs. Farnsworth breaks down. And he tells her she can't have visitors, etc., etc. There can't be a guest suite, etc., etc. And you think, is this really the kind of object that we can take seriously? And people keep on saying, oh, so beautiful. And we're saying, it is so repugnant. Come on, man. It is really repugnant. It is ugly. Farnsworth House is disgustingly ugly. And we have to face up to that, because when we face up to that, there's a whole lot of other things where the beauty emerges from it, where you say, but there's a kindness that is here. They are architects who had real respect for each other, for their clients, who did not abuse them and manipulate them. They're architects who did not treat the woman in their office with contempt and fathered children and walked away from it, etc., etc. We do have to confront the role of, you know, this master architect, you know, particularly its male fashion in the 20th century. Sometimes the artifacts you want to see in isolation of the people who made it, and sometimes, you know, like Farnsworth House, you just cannot separate it. You know, Mises' manipulation of the situation is not irrelevant in the production of that artifact. And hence, we must entangle those things and be critical, you know. Something about Adolf Loos, you know, this idea that decoration is a sin. But, you know, Gottfried Semper, I mean, he was European. I didn't think he ever traveled outside Europe, but he was very fascinated by things that came back from the colonies. And he was fascinated by artifacts and face painting and decorations and so on. And he published Maori people with tattoos on their faces. And Adolf Loos said, it's only the savage who will tattoo his face. And decoration is a sin. Now, this white architecture with its non-decorative character has held such a supreme place in European civilization, and it is taken as culturally neutral, and it is taken as modern. I'm telling you, it is racist and bigoted and based as a very old spat between Loos and Semper that in my mind, Loos lost through making a really insubstantial counter argument to Semper trying to say, but can we form a theory of architecture throughout the world rather than this sort of partitioned kind of thing? And I think it is important sometimes to take issue with that. And it's important for people to take issue with us, you know, in those things. And we could be wrong, very wrong with something that we think. And that's how we move forward as groups of people, as a profession, you know. And that's why I always listen. I think I prefer my adversaries to my admirers, because I think my admirers just contribute less to my growth, quite honestly.
Thanks so much.
Hello, we are Xiaozhang and Ana Loaiza. It's me. We are MArch1 and MArch2 students, and our question is on activism on private houses.
In public projects, architects usually have more freedom to leverage skill, location, and program to design spaces that foster social justice and equality. In private residential projects, promoting the idea of a social mission could seem an oxymoron at first sight. However, your work on private houses seems to keep the same attitude as in public use proposals. For instance, your own house floor and backyard are opened weekly to groups of people for certain events. And also in this picture, in House Van der Walt, the vacation house is divided into 3 smaller volumes to be hidden from climbers' size. So how do you remain activists when designing other private residential projects? And how do you engage your clients in working with this approach?
I think it's a really excellent question, and it's one that has preoccupied us, because one of the strange pathologies of a South African architect, and I think across the world, is you get architects who just go and do luxury houses. And it's as if they're working for another population from another planet where the concerns of this locale just doesn't matter. They seem to bring no ethic of their locale to their work. And it's always a little bit disturbing that you try and find then the best and most expensive international work where these issues somehow just doesn't matter, as if they don't exist. I wish that these issues sometimes did not exist, but they do, and we have to confront them. Now, I think what one must appreciate is in a private house is that, or in a public building, there are many more issues that simultaneously play themselves out that must be considered. When a private house, it's not always so, but it doesn't mean that there are no issues. So let's talk about this house in particular, and let's forget about its private domain. Let's think about what's its public domain, because it's a highly isolated building designed to be invisible. Those are very particular photographs taken so that you can see what it looks like. We have other photographs that we've taken of the building where you see it as truly invisible in the landscape. So this one, we get the sun at an angle from which the public can never see it, etc., and then the house becomes more visible. The question is, what's its public dimension? So for instance, the client was conscious that the mountains around the site is often climbed by nature lovers, and they can look back and see this house. And he said, I do not want to see my own house if I'm on the mountain, and I don't want anybody else to be able to see my house. So this idea of its invisibility, even from a very high vantage point, was very significant. So if you look at it, what we did is this house is built out of brick that is the same color as a rock. Now you might say, well, I can see in the picture it isn't. Now if you split these rocks, they're exactly the same color. And what you see is a thing called lichens that grow on the rocks. And these will grow onto the bricks over time. And we poured yogurt over the edge of the building so that they will begin to grow onto the surface and stain the surface. So in time, these two materials will grow very much into each other. But the issue was, how do you make these bricks then become the dominant material? And what we've done is that the walls are made out of it, but the building has a flat brick roof out of exactly the same brick that you have the walls made out of. So it's a roof construction that allows a 100% flat, absolutely cubic brick volume. So it has no roof to speak. It's just sheer brick mass, out of which there are then erosions in a way like the rocks. So it breaks up the volume in a way, and we checked by LiDAR scanning the scale of the rocks next to it. So the tallest volume that you see on the right-hand side of this building, there's a rock just a little bit further to the right that you're seeing on a short side, but on the other side is tall side. And these two volumes are the same size. So we related the volume of the building to the volumes of the rocks around it. But so one is to say, well, the public interest in this would be for it to be invisible. And that is fundamentally what we did. The other domain of this is that this is built in an area of what they call critical biodiversity. So not critically threatened, just a huge amount of diverse plants. So this farm probably has the amount of plant diversity that you would find in the entire United Kingdom. It is unthinkable, but you know, the Cape Floristic region has a far, far greater diversity of plants, say, compared to the floristic region that is the whole of Europe and all of Russia. So for a very small piece of earth, there's huge amount of plant specialization and endemicism. Now somebody approaches you to build a house on top of this, and you say, should we rather not build? So we did a long investigation. To make a long story short, as we consulted with botanists, and they say, no, you can build, it's no problem, because this critical biodiversity is not homogeneously spread across the surface. So they then walked us through the farm and said, look, yeah, there's this unbelievable diversity. But look at this part of the site. The rocks are coming out right on the surface and there's nothing growing there. So they said to us, basically, build this building on the rocks, because then you're going to threaten no biodiversity. And that would be the safest and most responsible place to do this, so that you don't have an effect on fauna of the area. Those are all public concerns. They're also the concerns of the client, and that's why they bought there. But they are concerns that shared with a society, and that is important in our society, and certainly we took it on board. So exactly how he likes his breakfast is irrelevant in that kind of a thing. But there's a kind of activism that's about fauna and flora and biodiversity and visibility here and so on, and a sense also of the relative density of using this land. So what you don't know in this house is that we built this house, and then the client broke down another house on the property. He has the right for 5 houses, but he broke down a second house that was there because it was in a very visible area. It made negative impacts on animal movements across the property, and that building was entirely removed and the land rehabilitated and so on. It's very much an initiative of the client himself. But in that sense, we're taking responsibility for the issues at hand. And, you know, then to get to the bigger question is that we always think that an ethical life is not to be concerned about all ethical issues on the entire planet. It's impossible for a human being. You're concerned about those that cross your way. It might sound a callous remark. I'm not concerned about all poverty on earth. I'm very concerned about the people in my road who suffer. And we will try and help the people in the road in a very, very direct and repeated way, very different from the way we treat global poverty as a sort of phenomena, because we think it restores the humanity in some of those relations. So the ethical exists for us in what crosses your path. And I think as an architect, it also means you don't have to look for the right commission. The question is, what's the ethics of those commissions that you have? What's the ethics that required for those commissions?
I think that's like a very detailed take to foster activism within practice. But you will also say that there's like this body of knowledge being built from project to project in the scope of private houses. We were wondering like how this body of knowledge built on the private houses design has nurtured other non-residential projects on time.
There's a kind of a experimentation that is allowed with private houses that is very difficult to get through when you're doing big public work, you know. So with instance with Gerard and Maya's house, we constructed that ourselves, so we were the contractor, and we were able to experiment with like textures of brick and, you know, how things are made in conversation with them in that sense, you know. And then with our own house, obviously we constructed this one. So there's, you know, so there's a kind of a learning that happens around how materials are put together that obviously becomes part of the practice for other things, you know. A little bit, obviously, more control of the experimentation part of building when we're doing private houses or homes or smaller projects and things like that. The one with the one that you had on the screen, Huis van der Walt, I laughed actually now when you said that we poured yogurt on it. You know, I mean, isn't it a very unconventional thing to put yogurt onto the side of a building to encourage fungi to grow on it, you know, to encourage algae and things to grow on it. You could never really convince a big institutional client to say, today we're going to go and throw some yogurt on your side wall. So that's the kind of quirky stuff that one can get around to do when you're doing private houses, and it of course, you know, percolates within the practice in many different ways. And you know, one thing that came up with these questions is that we don't often talk about the houses, and I'm not sure why. You know, we should talk about it more, but I think there's a kind of expectation that there isn't. You know, this big social mission, this kind of, you know, big agenda of it's seemingly considered to be politically neutral, which it isn't. You know, we've just heard this conversation around Mies van der Rohe, his relationship with the client. It's deeply political and it's deeply societal, these things. And how can we begin to, you know, have a public conversation about that is something that we should consider more. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yes. I can maybe just say is that you can see we haven't done a huge amount of houses.
That's the other thing.
And we find is that people don't come to us to give them style. Either they think we have no style, or we're just too middle class to imbue them with style. We're just not those people. We don't attract those kinds of clients. But somehow we attract people who are quite eccentric. And one of the absolute touchstones of a good project is on the first meeting, Ilze and I say to each other, this person's really eccentric, or they have a very eccentric concern of a sort. They have a very particular focus. And what is wonderful about that is that, like all art, you need exaggeration in a way. And even when it comes to the previous question of an ethical consideration or political consideration, like this thing of I want it to be invisible, it's not every client who comes to you and say, I want a house, but I really need you to make it invisible for me. So there's something about the eccentricity of individuals that make for very enlightened and characterful discussions that lead to very characterful artifacts, but lead you into very particular experimentation, like what Ilze said. So I don't know if I'm giving away a trade secret, but we've never made any money on a house. There's just no way of making money because we just take too long at it. And there's so much experimentation. And so, for instance, that house that you had there up on the screen, we redrew the windows and doors to the final working drawings 13 times. It's an absolute waste of money. But what we did is we had a certain kind of a vision for it. This idea that the doors are completely invisible. There was something about the fascination of the Kandus and the building, the Utsen's house, and how he made the windows invisible from the inside. And we thought that we could make them slide into cavities. We detailed it right down to the last nut and bolt until we were so successful that they slid into cavities that the house felt like it was pure brick. And then we realized it wasn't satisfying. So we realized our intention, but the result wasn't as satisfying as we thought it would be. And then we said we're going to put these frameworks for sliding doors onto the walls on the outside that reveal the asymmetry and the way a wooden frame slides within a steel primary frame and so on. And that made the artifact far more joyous and pleasurable. And that you can only do if you can do it over and over. And you don't have a client saying, you know, I'm busy losing money. But you can just draw and draw and draw, throw it in the waste paper basket. Nobody knows that you're doing it and so on, but you can just keep on doing it and doing it and doing it. And through that, advance your own understandings of something. So for instance, there's a house, I think it's on our website called House Toussaint, where we developed a very simple system of getting light through the roof. And then we were asked to do a hospital, and we took that system and we just supercharged that system. But it's the same impulse. It's the same experimentation. And that one came out of a house that had a helicopter hangar in it, and the client would see it from above. And we were thinking, how can we make it stripy? And we were thinking also, the view was away from the sun. How do we get the sun and heat into the building? We came up with a stripy solution, but that was the right way to order a hospital 10 years later. As a space for experimentation, houses are fantastic.
Hello. Thank you for being with us today, and nice to meet you again. My name is Ala, and my question is about education as social structure. So since Cape Town public schools are built with very limited budgets, displaying the unequal conditions of spatial quality and living environments in South Africa. The cathedral-like forms in Cheribotha School display an interest in turning educational facilities, usually introverted because of control and security, into social condensers. What have you learned in these social interest projects which you have or may implement in other non-educational proposals?
You must appreciate is that, you know, we had this discussion about the public interest in a house. So all buildings have a public interest. If they are in the world, there is a public interest in some ways, whether the local city council have to give a building permit for it at its most basic level, or whether they are of a deeply politically provocative nature. There is a public interest. So they are not social project and non-social projects. I'm trying to think, whether maybe an underground potato storage might be a non-social project or something like that.
Non-educational.
Both the social dimension and there's the educational dimension. Now, one of the things that I think you very correctly identify in your question is that the public domain is severely challenged in South Africa, and I think many parts across the world. I think capitalism has tried to co-opt public space as a device for income generation and try to not let too much uncommodified public space exist. They exist as a historical remnant of very old pre-capitalist societies sometimes. But, in South Africa, the mall is the dominant public space. That is where some of the greatest excitement happens amongst groups of people and so on. And we often talk about this fight for the city as just for a public domain, and this expanding public domain and growing new kinds of public domain. So whether we're doing a school or commercial building, we're trying to be equivalently so. So I think it's very easy to make public spaces in a school where there's a basically, as they say in commerce, a captive market. But when we're doing a commercial building or business incubator where there's no expectation of an engaging public domain, those are the ones that's really important in a way, because there's something about expanding the public domain at every turn. And that is why we like implying the public domain, even in the structure of the architecture, as we answered, I think it was in the first question. So there is something about understanding where our communality and our common interests lie. Because I think, we live in a very, very divided and divisive society. And to find spaces of communality, of common interest, it doesn't mean we're suddenly all going to hold hands and sort of fraternal love. But there's something about what are those spaces of overlap where common interest arise. And I have a big faith in commerce as a basis of common interest, not necessarily the abusive kind of predatorial capitalism, but just the exchange of goods. It always strikes me, if you travel in a country where you can't speak the local language, you can point at something, you can show a note of money, and there's exchange that could happen, and we can be on our merry way. I can have an appreciation for something somebody sold to me. They're very thankful I gave them some money. And that kind of moments of interest, I think, is what we are interested in, and hence my interest in the economic basis of cities in a way, and how to open that up as much as possible. So you'll see is that in a school you have a captive market, but you have certain environments that are desaturated of economic opportunity in favor of a minority. And we've done a whole lot of thinking and work on thinking, how can we crack open those monopolies of space so that they are to the benefit of a broader public, just for business. And it's not just an economic thing. It's about this sense that interactions between people can happen on different terms, different kinds of goods exchange, different kinds of publics participating, not just commerce, but also recreation and so on. So, when we were asked to do a business incubator, the Watershed project, we did a business incubator and a market and a park and an exhibition hall and some offices. And we convinced the clients that a more diverse public patronage will give more diverse public interaction between the various role players. The diversity of public interactions will give a richer public life. And in that sense, we try and expand it, and they, to come back to the opening statement, it's harder to work in places where you don't have a sort of captive public as you have in a school.
Thank you so much. I guess I have a quick follow-up question regarding the Sherry Botha School. I'm kind of curious, what was the community's response after it was opened?
There are, of course, many publics, and it's important to understand, and I would say some publics loved it, and some were somewhat critical, and maybe were thinking through all of that. So, I mean, at the most wonderful level is that we made sure that the school can use their hall for a school play. It's a long story. But Ilze and I were invited to go to the school play there one day. And I can tell you there were tears streaming down my eyes, just sitting there and watching this school where every kid gets a chance, no matter of capability and so on. And they are loving that place and they are so proud of it. And you think, wow, this feels so good. You know, I don't need to win any award or piece of paper or any kind of professional recognition. I can see it in the eyes of parents. So for instance, we did work on a completely other site, other people. The office administrator of one of the very senior people that we worked with called me and said, you know, I'm not calling today to set up a meeting. I'm calling you to say my child is actually in that school. And we went there today for the first time. And we are so thankful because before it was a very tough space that our child was in. And now we are so hopeful. We are so excited and that kind of thing. You know, those very basic comments that people call you up and just out of the blue tell you why they like something or something. That is really very nice. We've been very lucky with that school is that the principal, who's an educationist, the deputy principal is a psychologist and so on, has had massive appreciation for the school and has written papers on its value and so on. We've managed to win awards for it and so on that tells us the profession likes it. But we know that the Auditor General doesn't like it. The Auditor General came to visit the building. They sent a delegation because they were deeply concerned. They saw photos of the building. They were deeply concerned. They sent a team of people to interrogate us because they said the building were over budget. And we said it wasn't. It was about a week before the final handover, and they said this building must be over budget. We said it isn't. They said, well, what is the budget? We said, this was the budget. They said, what is the budget today? We said, this was it. It was within 0.7% on that day. And they said, but it must be over budget. We said, well, we just explained to you it isn't. There's an independent quantity surveyor who verifies it. There's a representative government who verified it. They said, but it just looks really good. We said, well, is that a problem? They said, yes. I mean, none of our schools look this good. And they were deeply upset. And they're saying, but we could have made it cheaper. I said, well, within your budget that you gave us, we made the thing this nice. And they say, but we could have made it cheaper. You know, and that's a very weird and difficult discussion. So we prioritize the money on the public space. They think we could take the public space away and then make a really cheap school. Now, that's a very tough conversation to have because I don't think that's a way to make a school. But that's somebody that was critical of it. I think unjustifiably so, but you know, so you have people who are very removed from it, then you have the commissioners, then you have the people who occupy it, then you have the parents who are there, and there are different appreciations at those different levels. But I would say that, you know, I think the school is overwhelmingly appreciated.
In our past life as a practice, we organized architectural tours of significant buildings. And we develop a bit of an audience around that, mainly architects and students of architecture to look at the architecture, you know, the tectonics and the space.
Everybody for money.
And then
so we said, well, why don't we organize a tour and we'll give you the proceedings or the proceeds, right?
Exactly. So that's exactly what happened. We used our platform that we've already had for a very long time, and we sort of opened it up as an architectural tour, and in that way raise money for the school for extra things that they wanted to do. But what also came out at that event is that there's another kind of appreciation, you know, around the making, and we were able to share some of our ideas to some colleagues around that as well, which is quite nice. Architectural tours is actually much better lecture spaces for talking about architecture than the lecture space, you know. So we just think about that actually, you know, how does one do that? But anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is on representation, on inclusive drawing. So a running thread through many of Wolff's projects is the commitment to hone drawing in imagining and designing inclusive spaces through the production of drawing itself. And this question is mainly developed by Chris D'Amico, who couldn't be here. Particularly in your earlier projects, your color drawings and watercolor insinuated a faster synthesis, bringing together urban form and personal expression to create a more accessible design process for people that wouldn't normally view or necessarily understand architectural representations. That playfulness, in a way, disappeared in the recent public projects like Watershed, at least in its representation. So do you still believe it is possible to use hand drawing as an act of inclusion in the design process itself? In the same way, other art practices use public drawings, like for instance, the public drawings by Atelier Bauer?
I see there's some response to the polychromatic versus black and white. And I can tell you, we had a man who worked in our office who was a graphic designer called Mukwena Kubeleka. And now, Mukwena, you could ask him to design anything. He will always make it in black and white. It was just nothing as beautiful as black and white. And he was very good at it. And it very much influenced our sensibilities in a way, is that this sense of his, that in the end, the most beautiful things are black and white. And there's something about reproducing on paper, very simple reproductions on photocopy machines and so on, just a simple black line, good typography, that kind of thing, black on white paper. It's like lino cuts. We love it in a way. It has a power that you can't get away from. But Ilze will know I spent the past weekend for the whole weekend. I didn't speak to anybody, developing highly polychromatic drawings. So we waver between the sort of polychromatic and non-polychromatic as two extremities. One is because we like colorful buildings and not represented very well by black and white. So Mukwena got us into lots of trouble with his love for black and white, but there is something about the power of black and white that talks about light and shade and configuration and so on. But there is something about playfulness. And I think Ilze and I take playfulness very, very seriously. Ilze can maybe talk about all sorts of processes that she's involved in that is very, very open to people. But for instance, in teaching, I developed these, what's called serious games. It's like flight simulators are called serious games. They're not games. They are rehearsals of very serious human situations. And what we would do is we would stage land grabs and those kinds of things, where we build really rough, very fast models, but where the focus is on process and habitation. So you find is that what the polychromatic and the black and white drawings have in common is a preoccupation of habitation as preceding the construction, and that a social construct precedes a configuration of space. And the meaning of the configuration of space is born out of a sense of the social construct.
For us, it's around how does one generate new ways of representing, because the kind of new architectural interventions and the knowledge needs to be accompanied by kind of a new representational model. We have kind of very sort of, traditional ways of doing it in our bigger profession. And I'm always trying to disrupt personally those traditions, So for instance, I wasn't very good at making models as an architecture student, but now I'm obsessed about how does one make quick models and represent various ideas through paper models and, tape, and using very simple materials to communicate sketches essentially, right? There's a kind of like, once you convince yourself it's a game, or once you convince yourself that you are playing, because that does require convincing. We're all very serious about our architecture and our things, and the schools made us into that. But you have to convince yourself that you're busy playing.
Can I interject quickly? Is to give you a perspective of this, is our 10-year-old son one day complained. He said, why are we dropping him off at school when we can go to the office? We said, what do you mean? And he was referring to all these stickers and things that Ilze is cutting and so on. He's saying, you can do that all day while I've got to do geography and science.
Felt very sad for him. But it also, there was an earlier question that alluded to the fact that our house becomes this semi-public space now and then. Yeah, that's an intentional decision that we made to engage young children into the creation of making. They think that I'm teaching them art with my friend Frankie, who's a theater maker, but they're actually teaching us, subliminally, or we're teaching each other, So we provide materials, we provide the space, and then we just say, let's just play, and the things that come out of those workshops is phenomenal, We draw from that energy and in the practice of representation, and we've made publications that actually is a kind of a direct conversation with that kind of playful making and analog style, because one of the frustrations that I have is that we are inundated with technology and we are burdened by producing through technology. And I think that is a very unfair burden that we put on ourselves. And I would really like us to get away from that and start making things again.
And maybe just to bring this back to one of the very first questions, there are those drawings that you show, but the output, I can't call it just drawing. It is not just model building. It's making of a whole kind of sorts, from picking flowers and cutting paper and sticking stickers and messing with children and all sorts of stuff, and building very serious, very durable wooden models, etc., etc. But the project is about unlearning your certainties. So one of the things that Ilze and I committed to is attacking our own education, undermining what we know, and trying to erode it to the thinnest possible remnant of what we can. It is just like research. When you're sitting with a scissors and a piece of paper, you don't look like a researcher. In the art world, people take that as a research of sort. But in architecture, you're a little bit of a not so serious airhead. But there's something about this thing between reading very serious text or reading artifacts and environments, and then buffooning around with bits of paper and so on, and unlearning as many of your certainties as possible, and going between spaces of confidence, of action, and then spaces where you actually bewilder yourself and unlearn what you know, as a way of just saying, how do we operate in a world where the certainties are so poisonous, and we want to disassociate ourselves with them, from them so substantially. It's all good and well to say, I hate Farnsworth House, but what is it that I love? That is a more complex. I think it's easy to criticize Farnsworth. It's difficult to go and give very precise, articulate vision of what is that next thing that replaces it, that can be as persuasive and cultural artifact as Farnsworth may have been to its audience in the 60s.
Yeah, also our education is very white. So we have to unlearn it. And it's very, it's very homogenous, you know, especially in a place like South Africa. It's changing now, obviously, and we love watching the evolution of educational training. But from like the space that I come from in terms of educational training, it was extremely calcified in this kind of glorification of architecture and the people that produced it. And that needs to actively be dissolved and unlearned, and kind of, you know, what happens to the emergence of that unlearning is what we're also interested in, like as Heinrich was explaining.
We have two questions from our public, one by Cruz. And Cruz Garcia, please jump in.
Hi, Ilze. Hi, Heinrich. So I've been sneaking in here, just listening to everything. It's fascinating because it's not just your work, but it's like you two are such, I think, robust and critical thinkers. It's my morning gift to listen to you for this hour. I have a question that is in reality two questions bundled up, and it has to do a bit with your research and also with the current situation in South Africa. On one hand is a question about some forms of research about characters, historical characters, and what role do they play in the way that you look at problems and conditions of the land, of the politics. You know, like I'm thinking of your work with Bessie Head, with Arthur Norge now, with the Rex Trueform factory. How is that allowing you to provide a different reading of the city and of the country in a way, but also I think that in a larger context to histories of racial segregation and so on, and you know, occupation, etc., colonization. And the other one is related also how this goes back to your practice, you know, as Ilze and Heinrich, and how do you see your character and your personas drawing or keeping away certain type of clients? You know, who's coming to you because of who you are and who is not coming to you because of who you are? And I think this is a question that is not only about clients, of course. It has to do also with the institutions, with the universities. So in a way, they're both related, right? One is on the historical characters that may allow you to open up some questions. And on the other is about the context in which you are in this very historical moment, right? As history is changing, or we are trying to change history.
Well, thank you for that. It comes out of this process of making a publication, and also it's linked to the previous comment around how do we unlearn what we learned before. So the main protagonist of our education is, we've listed them. We don't need to talk about them again, but we've listed, those are the guys that we learned made architecture and made spatial interventions supposedly of consequence. I'm in the process of finding muses, so people that inspire particular interventions in architectural space that is nourishing for our practice, but also we need to pay attention to those kinds of practices. And many times people that had major influences on thinking about spatial practice very differently, but were not recognized as architects, like trained, people in the profession and made buildings. So Bessie Head is one of those characters. She's predominantly known as a writer. And there's a whole kind of sphere of literature and writing about her writing. Or I've sort of found a groove within Bessie Head's work that she was a very important spatial practitioner as well, through the production of a house, through the documentation of Serowe, a village of the Rainwind, a book on the village, and it's an anthropological spatial study, and through the communal garden that she produced with other people amidst some of the most catastrophic, brutal, separated, urban slum clearance in South Africa. She was making a garden. So I really like this juxtapositioning of the brutality of racism on the one hand, and people making a new space of production and of food and of a collective freedom within that. Yeah, so that's why we do it, and that's why we need it, and then the kinds of people that come to us to work with us and to employ us are people who are on the same wavelength, thankfully, so the University of the Western Cape has been a huge supporter of our work through the commission of an art school that's under construction. And many of the things that I'm talking to you now about, many of the conversations we're having, the people that we deal with there, and we don't have to explain, we don't have to talk, we can talk shorthand. The politics, the ethics, the spatial ideas are completely in line with our practice. So you don't have to start with like, this is racism, this is the effects of racism, this is urban regeneration, this is gender. You don't have to start with that, So it's like, it continues our conversation, so it's great from that point of view. So shout out to the University of the Western Cape.
Maybe one of the things I can just add to it is an idea of Fred Moton's. It's not ours, but when we heard it, we thought, wow, that really is describing what we've been trying to do. Because on the one hand, there's the project of criticizing anti-blackness. Now, you can imagine in South Africa, that's an enormous task, and it's a task full of negativity. I don't know how to describe it. It is depressing, it is saddening, it is triggering, but it has to be done. But that is only countered by something that Fred Moton is calling for, celebrating of Black lives, which is also something that we're doing. It's to saying, well, what is happening? Because if you just have the project of hypercriticality on the one hand, it becomes very difficult. I think personally, just to just tell those stories as if the world is hopeless in a way, because there's so much of that problem around. But there's something about celebrating great lives and celebrating Black lives, where there's something about saying, well, what has been achieved? What can we learn? What are those ideas that you can take forward? What are the kernels of new ideas? It's the basis of a next generation's actions. And that is a really wonderful thing, because that makes it fun and joyous. So while you're busy with the other project, those two things are very important balance in a way.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thank you, Cruz. And Camilo Restrepo is also making a question from the audience. Camilo, how are you doing?
Hey, Diego, thank you very much. Ilze, Heinrich, it's a great pleasure. I'm amazed by not only by the work, but of course, your optimism and your generosity in every answer and in every comment. I think that there is something that it's very interesting in your work, perhaps similar to the work we do in Colombia or in some places in Latin America, where architecture mediates conflict in a very direct way. Let's say that perhaps in a frame of critical realism, being able to place a lot of capacities and efforts to the building or to the intervention, either being public or private, as you mentioned, also with the houses, that I think that it's interesting in the sense that you place a lot of capabilities into the building in a, as I mentioned, in a practical way and pragmatical. That it's interesting in the sense that it doesn't construct an absolute space. It creates a very porous space where there is this big question about size and scale, very similar to what happens with some of the Paulistas architects, where the building in its porosity and its development, it's able to conciliate society, environment, materiality. That I think it's very interesting. I will love to hear more about that, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm making an interpretation of your work. Thank you.
That's beautiful. I think, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
It's a very perceptive comment. I think it's the first person who's ever detected that in our work. But, you know, one of the first things that Ilze and I did, we met 19 years ago. We flipped a coin as to whether we can go to India together or Brazil together. I wanted to go to India. Ilze wanted to go to Brazil. She won. Her coin fell in her favor, and we went to Brazil, and we had a really good time there.
It was very transformative.
But there's something about the Paulistano school where there's something about this openness to a public domain that has a correspondence in climate that truly doesn't exist in ours, because the wind doesn't blow in Sao Paulo like it does here. We have very strong winds. And also is that, you know, I always think modernism was invented to be Brazilian. It's like, you know, it's like, I think, you know, I always think, I wish I could be a fly on the wall, knowing what Le Corbusier said when Oscar Niemeyer started like really getting traction. And he must have said, oh my God, what's this guy doing? It's like, it's actually nice and warm. So we can put a building up above the ground and make shade. There's actually a need for it. But when you're doing it in the north of France, there's no need whatsoever to make shade. You don't want shade, you want sun. You know, the upper side of Villa Savoy makes sense because it wants the sun in, but the lower side makes no sense. Why would you lift it off the ground? That's why they put the servants and the cars there, because it is not considered part of the house. It's not a house in the sky. It's like trying to annihilate a part of residential beings and those who occupy it, you know, and then you paint it green, like it's not really there. It's like, this building's not on the ground, I promise you. But there's something about this openness of Paulistano school, which is just remarkable. I mean, I think it's remarkable in the world. And then this thing of them opening the roads and opening facilities, it is just quite unbelievable what has happened there. But then this correspondence between this mega infrastructure that holds these public spaces, it's certainly been an inspiration for us. So if you look at something like the watershed, that is a very Capetonian version of Paulistano infrastructure, in a way, but saying we really need to protect it against the wind. We really need to be careful about how cold it gets there, because it never gets so cold in Sao Paulo that you have to worry about it, that the spaces become unpleasant. So the Carpenter Center at Harvard is a miserable piece of space because the undersides are so shady. I mean, I was there on a cold day. I couldn't believe what a dreadful space it is. So, I mean, I'm trained to just like it. I cannot get myself to dislike it because I'm so preconditioned to liking it and to knowing what is great about it. But it's like, you know, if I think of cold climate, you want to open up like a flower to the sun. You don't want an underside. Those undersides are miserable. It could have just stood on the ground. It would have been much better. Sorry, the watershed building that we did in that huge street through is a Paulistano move. And even the school that we did that makes these public spaces, it does it through courtyards rather than, say, canopies, but it makes these semi-roofed spaces that relate to our climate, high wind and very wet, miserable winters in a way. But the instinct is Paulistano, I can tell you that definitely.
And also the conservation sensibility of somebody like Lino Bobardi, you know, it was, I mean, the thoughtfulness in the work of reconstructing buildings, of refurbishing spaces. I mean, the Rex Trueform book is in a way an ode to that the SE Pompeii factory, you know, like I wish that the Rex Trueform factory in Cape Town could be injected with life as the SE Pompeii factory in Sao Paulo, you know. So it was a hugely transformative journey that we went to Brazil. We covered a lot of cities there when we were there, and trying to see what is the sensibilities of the architects working in there. And we spent a lot of time looking at Lina Bobadi's buildings because it's so joyful. You know, the interventions are just so injected with joy and care and thought and a kind of a spirit of collaboration. I mean, obviously we had a great time with Oscar and Alfonso Redi and, you know, Mendes de Rocha and all those guys. But it's a huge influence in the way we think. And also, I think the broader Latin America, I haven't had the privilege to go to other Latin America cities, but I know lots of thinkers from there that we draw from, especially decolonial thinkers. We had the privilege of having Walter Menola over for dinner when he came to Cape Town. So we are influenced by the thought of the decolonial thinking that comes from the continent there. We've got, you know, our friend Cruz also sort of on the spectre of thinking, Puerto Rico. I mean, these are places we haven't been to, but we are in conversation with, you know.
I can maybe add one more thing about Lina Bobadi, and there's this moment where she loses faith in modernism and where she's begin to entertain a lack of certainty, which is huge. I mean, we talk a lot about getting it. I don't know how she produced that uncertainty in her work, but it is amazing to see somebody let go of that. Because I think when she competed with all of those men, that wasn't so successful. When she started just letting go in a way of the certainties and going around space of great uncertainty. I mean, to be amongst those great Brazilian architects, it must have been very intimidating, which you found a completely different way by establishing a completely different starting point. And that capacity to real original thought is quite interesting in the context of a place that's actually worked very well in a tradition, you know, and that, of course, is a huge inspiration.
But I think there is something that it's interesting in the way your work drinks from that source of Brazilian architecture, in the sense that when we think about the Paulistano school in Brazil, there is always this sense of stereotomy dominating the whole approach to the architecture. You see as this huge building made pretty much about the same materiality, and at the same time providing the porosity and this ambiguity, right? But when I look at your projects, the ambiguity is there, which is fantastic, made by very, very specific elements of architecture, but at the same time inverting and negotiating constantly, even questioning the role of stereotomy and tectonic at the same time, making them operate in an inverted way. Something that seems to be basically stereotomy driven ends to be really created by the craft of the tectonic. And I think that's fantastic because it allows this kind of craft that it's not modern, it's not a handcraft, it's not industrialized, but at the same time, it composes this very hybrid response, hybrid in a very omibaba condition of negotiating the border, the limit, where things belong to a colony or those who want to get independent from it, creating a very interesting independent condition that I think it's very necessary for today as a space to deal with our conflicts in the way that not everybody comes to the talk because it's diverse or politically correct, but just for the sake of being different. And that's where the communication begins to happen. And that's where also all your public positioning about your houses makes a lot of sense for me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you have a very acute reading of the work and our interest, because this conflict between the tectonic and the stereotomic is, I mean, something we never speak about in public because it's always dominated by other debates. But I can tell you it's been an ongoing concern in a way, simply because there is these big traditions, and you find that architects sort of align themselves with a certain tradition, and then they pursue that. And the only thing I think I appreciate of Mies is his hypocrisy, when it comes to tectonics, where he lies and cheats. That is where it gets interesting. You know, that moment when somebody asks him about the corner of the Seagram, they say, why did you make it like that? I say, I can give you a good answer and the real answer. You know that answer, you know, where he says, well, you know, the column keeps it straight, it stops it from bending, and it does what. And people say, my goodness, that must be the real answer. You say, no, the real answer, it looks good, stupid. You know, and there's something about if you are too principled, you become a dictator of an aesthetic kind. And there's something about the looseness of a comedian, in a way, that is required, the looseness of a joke that is required, in a way, to imbue things with wit. Now, particularly in the context of limited resources, we don't have a lot of money. We can play between things very articulately assembled and then actually just mangled, because you cannot afford this very precise object. So there's something about going from a sort of mushy clay to something that is very sparkling and very sharp. You know, we have this obsession with starched collar. You know, this thing of the one part is really nice, but the trousers are dreadful and they cement on it, you know. And I think that is a very real preoccupation, but the sense that you need real looseness and then you need precision. And I mean, we spoke about the superform and the subform, but I can show you here in our house where we're saying some things will never be built well. And we just don't want to cry about people building things badly. And then you say, what will be the precise moment that really matters, that one joint that's absolutely straight, but all the rest can be all over the place. And it is a matter of judgment, and it's a pure aesthetic judgment at one level to say, how are we going to make this thing matter without it becoming too self-obsessed? Because the problem with, you know, some very, very beautiful tectonic work is it becomes very self-obsessed and self-referential. The author becomes centralized, and one way of construction, like steel construction or wood construction, becomes too dominant. And it doesn't become open to change over time, or otherness of a technological change, or of people re-inhabiting, of people painting it, or that kind of thing. But I think, I mean, that is a thing that I think we could speak about as a lecture in itself.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and hope to meet you here there one day. And thank you, Diego.
You're welcome. Ilze and Heinrich, many thanks for your time. You open up in many ways we didn't expect it. We had fun, actually. And lots of things going on in the private chat, which is always fun.
Yes, and thanks for the format.
Yeah, I think it was great, because now, you know, these kinds of things always make us think about our own work and these beautiful observations, and now understand that we must talk more about the houses. There's this idea of porosity. It's basically the preparation is now done for your lecture cruise.
Thank you. And congrats to the students who prepare amazing questions.
Thank you.
Also, everybody else who attended, thank you for coming. And we'll stop recording now. You can stay if you want.
Bye. Thank you.